I raised her since she was a baby. 15 years later, she came back with a psychiatrist and quietly filed paperwork to lock me in a mental facility. I heard them whisper at night, "Once she's declared incompetent, this house is ours. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong." Subscribe now so you won't miss the next shocking chapter in our films. The morning mist still clung to the ground like a reluctant ghost when Matilda Rhodes stepped through the cemetery gate. The wrought iron creaked behind her, a sound too familiar to startle her anymore. She moved slowly, wrapped in a long gray coat that trailed like memory behind her. Each footstep crunched the frost-bitten gravel, steady and deliberate, until she reached the headstone marked Dr. Walter H. Rhodes, 1939-2014, beloved husband, trusted mind, unshaken soul. She stood in silence. Not the kind of silence that invited peace, but the brittle, heavy kind that comes only after something has ended and nothing has begun to replace it. A sparrow fluttered in the cedar tree above, then stilled. Even the wind paused around her. Matilda slid one gloved hand from her coat and placed her fingers gently along the top of the stone. The granite was cold. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to pray, not quite, but to hold something invisible and important in her mind. Walter's voice, the timbre of it, the way it curled when he was amused, the way it sharpened when he was afraid. "It's been 9 years," she murmured, "and yet I still find myself turning to tell you things." The words dropped into the still air unanswered but not unheard. Matilda didn't cry anymore, not here. Her grief had dried into a sort of sediment that clung to the corners of her day. What remained now was vigilance and habit. When she turned to leave, the fog had thickened around the cemetery road. The world blurred at the edges. Only the house awaited her now. The Rhodes estate was once a proud structure perched halfway up the hill in rural Oregon, a place Walter had chosen for its distance from everything. Space, he used to say, gives clarity. But in his absence, the house had taken on another nature. It sat now like an old creature curled into itself, full of rooms with shut doors and locked drawers. Matilda walked up the stone path, passing the overgrown rose beds and the moss-darkened statue of Minerva near the porch. She noticed the cracked window pane in the study again. 3rd time this month. No one to fix it anymore. Inside, the house smelled like old wood books and chamomile. She dropped her coat over the banister and moved toward the kitchen, setting the kettle on, as she had every morning for decades. She didn't bother turning on the lights. The gray of dawn was enough. By the time the water boiled, she'd already fed the cat, read 3 pages of the Federalist Papers, her daily ritual, and stood gazing at the empty chair across the table. Walter's chair, untouched. The faintest depression still in the cushion, or perhaps her mind supplied it out of stubborn memory. She carried her tea into the front room and stood at the window overlooking the driveway. The gravel was dry, scattered with pine needles and a hint of ice. She had nowhere to go. No one was due to visit. So when the black sedan turned into the driveway just after 8, her pulse hesitated. The car glided up slowly, purposefully. New, shiny, out of place. She stepped away from the window tension, settling like an old coat around her shoulders. 3 sharp knocks. She opened the door with practiced calm, her hand already resting lightly on the latch beneath the knob. And there she was. "Hello, Aunt Matilda?" The voice was familiar, worn at the edges like an old photograph that had sat too long in the sun. Isabel. 15 years had passed since she'd last seen her. Time had molded the girl into a woman of angles and confidence. Her hair was darker now, pulled into a tight braid that said control more than style. She wore a cream coat with matching gloves and pearl earrings, too much for a casual visit, not enough for a funeral. Behind her stood a tall man with dark eyes and a perfectly conservative smile. "This is Marcus Isabel," said, gesturing to him with effortless ease. "My fiancé." Marcus extended his hand. "It's a pleasure, Mrs. Rhodes. I've heard so much about you." Matilda's eyes didn't leave Isabel's. "I can't say the same," she said, voice level. "You'd better come in." The sitting room had not changed since Isabel last stood in it. She said as much while Marcus looked around with polite admiration. "It's exactly how I remember it," Isabel said, fingers brushing the edge of the piano. "You haven't changed a thing." Matilda settled into the high-backed chair by the fireplace, watching them. "That's because I haven't forgotten anything," Marcus chuckled. "You must be a very sentimental woman." "No," Matilda said, "just aware of what's mine." There was a pause, a brief stillness where no one spoke. Then Isabel leaned forward. "We've been traveling through the state. Marcus has a conference in Portland. I thought, after all this time, maybe we could reconnect." Matilda sipped her tea. "Reconnect implies we were once truly connected." Isabel gave a tight smile. "I was a teenager. You know how things were." "Yes," Matilda remembered. The screaming match in the hallway. The broken porcelain dish. The slammed door. Isabel leaving with a boy Matilda had never met. The phone calls that stopped. The birthdays missed. The letters never answered. "You left," Matilda said quietly, "and you stayed gone." Isabel looked down. "People change. That remains to be seen." Marcus broke the tension. "I'm sure this must be overwhelming. It's been a long journey for Isabel, and she's missed you more than she lets on." Matilda turned to him. "And you, Marcus? What do you do?" "I'm a psychiatrist," he said, "private practice. Behavioral assessment mostly." "I see," she said slowly. "So you study people." He smiled again. "Something like that." Their eyes met. For a second, just a breath of one, Matilda felt the floor shift. There was nothing overt, no threat, no flicker, but something in his gaze lingered too long on the architecture. His eyes traveled the room like a silent appraiser. The walls, the paintings, the sideboard, not the memories, the materials. She'd seen eyes like that before. They stayed for over an hour. The conversation turned soft, general, full of pleasant questions. "How have you been? Do you still write? Is the estate a lot to manage?" Matilda answered without answering, drifting between deflections and politeness. She offered them tea, declined their offer to help her sort the paperwork, and listened carefully when Marcus casually mentioned how aging could be unpredictable, especially mental sharpness. It was an innocent remark, harmless almost, but it landed like a stone in her gut. When they left, Matilda watched them walk to the car. Marcus opened the door for Isabel, leaned in, whispered something. She laughed. The black sedan reversed, then slid away down the gravel path. She didn't wave. That night Matilda couldn't sleep. She wandered the hallway in slippers, trailing her fingers across the familiar wallpaper. At the end of the hall was Walter's study. She hadn't stepped foot in it in over a year, not since she'd sealed the drawers and locked the cabinets. But now, she stood before the door, key in hand. The lock turned with a dry click. Inside the room was perfectly preserved. Dusty, yes, but untouched. His desk, his leather chair, the tall bookcase with the rolling ladder. A scent still hung in the air, faint cologne and old ink. She moved to the desk, opened the second drawer, pulled out the ledger she hadn't dared look at since his passing. She turned the pages. His handwriting, dates, property records, legal notes, mentions of the estate trust, and a line scribbled in red ink across the margin. "If Matilda is ever challenged, find Noah." Her breath caught. She ran her hand across the page, eyes scanning for more. And there it was. Amendment Secondary Executor Noah Linsdale. The name dropped like an anchor. She stood up slowly, closed the ledger, locked the drawer again. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would find Noah, because tonight, in the quiet of her dead husband's study, with the fog curling at the windows and the echo of long-gone voices brushing the walls, Matilda Rhodes knew one thing with absolute clarity. This house was not just bricks and land. It was memory. It was promise. And someone had just come back to take it. The second morning after their arrival, Matilda woke to the sound of soft, clinking glass downstairs, the kind of sound that didn't belong to breakfast or tea. It was too cautious, too deliberate. She pulled on her robe and slippers, moving silently down the back staircase that curved along the east wall of the estate. Her bones ached in the usual way, but her senses felt sharpened. In the hallway just before the landing, she paused. Voices. "I'm telling you, it has to be somewhere." Isabel's voice came through thinly, half whisper, half hiss. It's a 5,000-square-foot house, darling, came Marcus's low reply. We're going to need time and subtlety. Matilda felt her stomach twist, but she didn't step forward. Not yet. She heard drawers opening, paper rustling. Isabel again. She still has everything in that awful cabinet. I thought she would have gotten rid of some of it by now. Marcus chuckled softly. That's good for us. Sentimental people rarely hide things well. Matilda stepped back just once, then turned quietly and disappeared into the shadows of the second-floor corridor. She didn't confront. She remembered Walter's voice again. Don't react first. Watch, then move. By the time she entered the kitchen from the west hallway, 10 minutes later, they were already seated at the table, fresh-faced, cheerful, and pouring orange juice into glasses like nothing had happened. Good morning, Isabel sang out. Good morning, Aunt Matilda, Marcus added, all warmth and smooth edges. Matilda smiled faintly. Morning. By midday, Marcus had approached her while she was tending to her indoor fern, an old stubborn plant Walter once said had more lives than their cat. I was wondering. He began with that pleasant tone of his, the kind that was always almost convincing. If you've ever considered doing a wellness screening, just general health and cognitive checkups. Nothing invasive. She looked up from the plant. Is this about my memory? No, not at all. You're incredibly sharp, I can tell, he said, laughing lightly. But it's best to have a professional baseline, especially in your golden years. It gives you more control, not less. More control. She wiped her hands on a towel and looked at him plainly. And who would be doing this evaluation? Well, he shifted just enough to make it seem casual. I have a colleague. Dr. Hallen, brilliant geriatric specialist. I could have him come by just for a few simple tests. We wouldn't need to leave the house. Matilda tilted her head slightly. That's very thoughtful. Just want to help, Marcus replied. That night, Matilda barely slept. She sat by the fire in Walter's old study, drinking lukewarm tea and reading through her husband's handwritten notes on behavior. She wasn't thinking about what Marcus said. She was thinking about what he didn't. She could feel them circling her like cautious wolves, smiling, charming, concerned, but never quite sincere. Isabel's affection felt manufactured like a play she'd rehearsed too many times in front of a mirror. The third morning, Matilda walked into the drawing room and found Isabel with the family photo albums spread across the floor. Dozens of photographs lay out like evidence in a case, birthdays, anniversaries, trips. Walter's face in almost all of them. I thought I'd help organize some of this, Isabel said sweetly. I've always loved the picture of us from my 10th birthday. Matilda sat down on the velvet armchair near the fireplace, watching her closely. That was the year you threw your shoes in the lake. Isabel blinked, paused, then laughed. I did, didn't I? God, I was dramatic. You still are. Isabel's face flinched so slightly it would have gone unnoticed to anyone but Matilda. I only want to reconnect, Aunt Matilda, she said softly. We lost so many years. I thought maybe we could start over. Matilda leaned back. Starting over implies honesty. Isabel didn't respond. The days bled together after that pleasant breakfasts, strategic small talk, and Marcus occasionally asking casual questions about the property. Do you still handle the estate taxes yourself? Who helps you with the legal paperwork? Is there anyone else on the deed? Matilda answered each one with the kind of polite ambiguity only years of academic debate could train into a person. But each time she did, she watched their eyes. Isabel's filled with frustration. Marcus's narrowed with calculation. Then came the moment everything cracked open. It was just past midnight when Matilda heard the creak, the one on the third step from the top of the basement stairs. She didn't hesitate. She reached for the small voice recorder she kept in her nightstand, a habit she picked up during her research years, and crept into the hallway barefoot. She moved like water through the shadows, pressing her shoulder to the wall as she reached the staircase landing that overlooked the kitchen. Below, lit only by the dim glow of the under-cabinet lights, were Marcus and Isabel. They weren't whispering now. They didn't think they needed to. Just admit it, Marcus said, his voice hushed but sharp. She's slower than she lets on. Yesterday she asked me the same question twice. That doesn't mean anything, Isabel said quickly. She's cautious, and she's watching me. She won't matter much once we have the paperwork, he said. But we need Hallen in here soon. Just one signed assessment declaring diminished capacity and everything shifts. Isabel's arms were folded tightly. She's not going to agree to an evaluation. She doesn't have to, Marcus replied smoothly. Not if we frame it right. A fall, a confusion episode, anything to trigger concern. Once Hallin's involved, the court won't question it. Isabel looked towards the stairway for half a second, just a flick of her eyes, and Matilda instinctively shrank back into the shadows. It feels wrong, Isabel whispered. Marcus stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. You said yourself you wanted that house, the life you were supposed to have. You want it or not. Isabel didn't answer. Matilda gripped the recorder tighter, her thumb steady over the button. You've done the groundwork, Marcus said. She trusts you barely. If we move fast, we can have guardianship petitioned within 2 weeks. Once we get control, we liquidate. House alone is worth $2 million, more if we gut the land. Isabel exhaled slowly. What if she resists? Marcus smiled faintly. Then we make it look like she's lost touch with reality. All we need is one public incident. Matilda's heart pounded not from fear, but from clarity. She had known. Somewhere deep down she had known. But hearing it, that was different. She returned to her room, closed the door, and leaned against it in the dark. The recorder, still warm in her hand, now held something far more powerful than sound. Proof. They weren't here to reconnect. They weren't here to help. They were here to take. She set the recorder carefully in the velvet-lined drawer of her writing desk and sat down with her notebook. In quick, precise handwriting, she jotted down every word she could remember from the conversation. Dates, time, tone. It was no longer a question of if she would fight back. It was only a matter of how. The next morning she made eggs. She brewed coffee. She greeted them with a grandmotherly smile and asked about their plans for the day. Marcus said he was going to drive into town, meet a colleague. Isabel asked if she could go through the old pantry and help clean it out. I'm thinking of trying out a new recipe, she said sweetly. Matilda nodded. How lovely. But behind her smile, gears turned. Isabel was already in motion, so now she would move faster. Later that afternoon, Matilda stepped into the library and pulled down a worn blue leather-bound ledger from the top shelf, one of Walter's private volumes. She flipped to the back where she knew he scribbled notes during his final months. There it was. Noah, if anything ever happens. Just that, just his name. Matilda exhaled. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed the book and moved to the writing table. She pulled out an envelope, crisp and new, and began to write. Noah, if this reaches you, it means the house is in danger. I hope you remember what we once spoke of. If you still carry that trust, I need you now. She sealed the envelope, then rang for Maria, the housekeeper's niece, who came in twice a week to dust and tidy. I need you to deliver this for me, she said. Directly. No mail. No questions. Maria blinked but nodded. She had always liked Mrs. Rhodes. When she was gone, Matilda turned to the fireplace and stared into the quiet coals. The house had never truly felt haunted until now. Not by ghosts, but by the living. And this time the ghost wasn't her husband. It was Isabel, the girl who once held her hand at the piano bench. Now a stranger with her face. A stranger who had come home with one purpose. Take. But Matilda Rhodes had spent a lifetime studying the mind, and she had just begun to fight. The old library hadn't been touched in years. Not properly, anyway. Matilda had kept it clean dusted, the shelves aired the room, but no one had dared disturb its order since Walter passed. It was his domain, a sanctuary of wood-paneled silence and worn leather bindings. Books were stacked floor to ceiling, some vertical, some horizontal, some leaning drunkenly against each other like they hadn't slept in decades. The room always smelled like old cedar and something darker ink, maybe, or memory. But now Matilda stood in the doorway with her hand on the threshold, breath held like a diver above black water. She stepped inside slowly, her cane tapping gently against the parquet floor. The door clicked shut behind her with a kind of finality she hadn't expected. She didn't bother turning on the overhead light. The late afternoon sun spilled through the stained glass window above the reading alcove, casting pale gold across the carpet. She moved to the far wall, the third shelf from the left. She ran her hand along the spines until she felt at a slight protrusion just behind an unmarked volume bound in navy cloth. She tugged, and the book gave way to reveal the small iron latch behind it. She flipped it open with her thumbnail and pulled. A click. The shelf slid outward with a soft grind, revealing a hidden drawer. She opened it slowly. Her heart was steady. Her hands were not. Inside, neatly folded, was a yellowed envelope, her name written on the front in Walter's unmistakable hand, Matilda. She sat down hard on the nearby stool, cradling the envelope like it might disappear. She didn't open it right away. She stared at it, traced the edges, ran her fingers over the ink, faded but legible. Finally, she slid her nail under the flap and unfolded the single page inside. My dearest Matilda, if you are reading this, I am no longer there to explain the decision I've made. But you must know it was never made out of doubt, only love and caution. And, in the event of my death, should you ever find yourself compromised legally, mentally, or physically, there is only one man I trust with the estate and your protection. His name is Noah Linsdale. You remember him. I know you do. He has no claim to the road's name, but he carries its spirit better than most. I've amended the estate documentation to reflect this and had the changes filed through Harrison and Boone under sealed protocol. If it comes to this, do not wait. Find him. Bring him back. He is your safeguard, and he owes you more than he will admit. Love always, W. Matilda's eyes didn't sting, not yet. But her chest felt like someone had poured warm cement into it and let it set. She folded the letter with deliberate care and placed it in her apron pocket. Noah. She hadn't spoken that name aloud in nearly 2 decades. Not since the last time she saw him 30 pounds thinner with dirt under his fingernails and a fire in his eyes that looked far too much like a cry for help. He was just a boy then, 22, fresh out of a rehab center, hired by Walter for odd jobs around the garden. Matilda had found him sitting behind the greenhouse one evening with a bottle of turpentine pressed to his face, breathing it in like it was air. She had slapped it from his hands, made him tea, sat with him in silence. And from that night on, he never left the property without saying goodbye. He left the state a year after Walter's funeral. No address, no contact, but Walter had made arrangements behind her back. Typical, still trying to protect her from the grave. She walked to the desk, pulled out the bottom drawer, and retrieved her correspondence ledger. Her handwriting had changed since she last wrote to him. Shakier now, more deliberate, but the message came out crisp and clear. Noah. If this reaches you, it means what we feared has arrived. Walter was right. I need you. They're here, and they want everything. If you still remember what this place was, if any part of you still believes in what we built here, come home, please. M. She sealed the letter and tucked it inside a manila envelope. On the front she wrote a name, and the only address she'd ever had for him, an auto body shop in Klamath Falls. She didn't trust the post office. She didn't trust email. She didn't trust anything that touched the hands of strangers. So she called Maria. Maria was in her late 20s, had worked at the estate since her mother retired from housekeeping, and knew how to keep quiet. She came in quietly that evening, apron still dusted with flour. I need this delivered, Matilda said simply. By hand. No courier. Maria took one look at the envelope and nodded. When do you need it there? Tonight. I'll be back by morning. When the door closed behind Maria, Matilda sat down at her husband's desk and turned on the small reading lamp. It cast a warm circle over the polished mahogany surface. She stared at the grain in the wood, then at the small voice recorder resting beside the inkstand. Time to begin. She pressed record. Her voice, when it came out, was steady. This is Matilda Rhodes. Date, October 18th. Time, 8:42 p.m. Location, personal study, Rhodes Estate. Over the last 6 days, I have been approached with increasing concern from my estranged niece, Isabel Rhodes, and her fiancé, Dr. Marcus Vane. Both have presented themselves under the guise of family reconnection and wellness, but their behavior suggests deeper motivations, namely attempts to declare me mentally unfit and seize control of my estate. She paused, took a sip of tea, continued. I have overheard private conversations, recorded them as well, suggesting plans to manipulate legal guardianship proceedings through falsified evaluations. This recorder will document all subsequent interactions within the home from this point forward. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I'm relocated, or if signatures appear on legal documents, I do not recall authorizing this file,
is to be submitted to Harrison and Boone under the Guardianship Override Clause established by Walter Rhodes in 2013.
End entry. She clicked the button and exhaled. The air in the study felt heavier now, thick with the gravity of plans. She placed the recorder inside a hollowed-out copy of Great Expectations and slid it back onto the bookshelf. The next day she began recording everything. Over breakfast, she placed a second recorder under the table lip. At lunch, one beneath the tea tray. She even inserted one inside the frame of an old picture in the living room, the one with Walter in his college robes, standing beside a young Matilda wearing defiance-like perfume. And they talked. Oh, how they talked. Isabel asked if she'd considered downsizing. It must be hard being here alone. Marcus mentioned that early signs of cognitive decline often looked like innocent forgetfulness. Matilda smiled, nodded, said she'd been feeling more tired lately. They were already circling. She would let them draw closer, let them believe she was fading. That night, a storm moved through the valley. The house groaned under the weight of wind and memory. Thunder cracked against the hills like a gunshot from 100 years ago. Matilda sat by the fire, a blanket around her shoulders, listening to the wind whistle through the old chimney. And then her phone buzzed once. A message from Maria. Delivered. He took it, said nothing, just nodded. I think he'll come. Matilda stared at the words until they blurred. Then she smiled, just slightly, enough for her to feel the shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but motion. After all this time, something had begun to move again, and in the dark silence of the Rhodes estate, Matilda whispered the name of a man who had once been lost to the world. Noah. The knock came precisely at 10:00 a.m., not a minute early, not a breath late. Matilda was seated in the sunroom, a shawl draped across her shoulders, her teacup half full and cooling beside her. The morning light cast soft rectangles across the tiled floor, catching the edges of dust she hadn't bothered to clean. The house was still almost reverent. She heard the butler's footsteps. Maria's brother, covering shifts that week, crossed the marble. Then the low exchange of greetings. And then came the name. Dr. Hallen is here, ma'am. Ah, so it had begun. Matilda rose slowly, her body obeying with quiet resistance. She walked with her cane, not because she needed it that day, but because they expected her to. Perception was everything now. She met them in the drawing room where Marcus had already arranged the chairs. Too perfectly. One for the guest, one for the frail old woman, one for the observer. Dr. Hallen stood when she entered, tall and hollow-looking, with a balding crown and a soft beige tie that matched his voice. Mrs. Rhodes, it's a pleasure. I'm Dr. Elliot Hallen. I believe Marcus has mentioned me. He has. Matilda said, her tone airy, disconnected. Though I confess I forget things so often these days. Dr. Hallen smiled the way doctors smile when they think they've already won. The evaluation was meant to be casual. That's how Marcus phrased it. Informal, low-pressure, non-invasive. But Matilda knew better. They began with word associations, then time and date recall, then picture sequencing. She intentionally gave the wrong year 1979 instead of 2023. When asked to count backward from 100 by sevens, she paused midway and said, I'm terribly sorry. I think I was thinking of my sister. She used to love numbers. Or was that our cat? Dr. Hallen took notes with faint nods of encouragement. Marcus, seated silently in the corner, tried to look relaxed. But Matilda saw it, the tightness in his jaw, the fingers tapping against his knee. He wanted this over, wanted the paper, the signature, the key. When the test ended, Dr. Hallen packed his satchel with calm professionalism. I'll compile my notes and send along the assessment, he said. We'll proceed with care. Matilda tilted her head. Proceed with what? Dr. Hallen blinked. Marcus stood up too quickly. Just wellness documentation, Marcus said gently, in case we ever need it for insurance. You understand. Matilda smiled, not kindly. That night she took the recorder from beneath the drawing room table and replayed the session, listening closely to the nuances, the leading questions, the subtle framing, the shared glances between Marcus and the doctor when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She documented everything in her ledger, every pause, every deviation from protocol, every indication of collusion. Then she picked up the landline, the old rotary one in her bedroom, hidden beneath a stack of magazines, and dialed a number she hadn't touched in almost 6 years. 3 rings, then a voice gravelly, tired but precise. "Harrison and Boone, this is Franklin Harrison." Matilda smiled. "Franklin, it's Matilda Rhodes." A beat. Then, "Good God, Matilda. It's been years. Is everything all right?" "No," she said plainly, "but I need you to help me make it right." By noon the next day, Franklin Harrison was seated at her kitchen table, sleeves rolled to the elbows, glasses on the tip of his nose, flipping through a folder of legal documents older than half the people in the county. He had been their family attorney since 1982, a man of rules, of procedure, but also of unshakable loyalty. "I thought you retired," Matilda said, pouring him tea. "I did. But I never stopped being angry," he replied. She liked that answer. He skimmed the last few pages, then set the folder down with a solid thud. "Well," he said, removing his glasses, "Walter's handwritten codicil and the sealed trust document from 2013 are both still legally binding. Noah Linsdale is listed as successor guardian under Contingency Clause C. You're still the primary trustee, and the estate can't be altered without your notarized signature. Even if they say I'm unfit, especially then, because we filed a dual authentication protocol back in 13. Any declaration of mental incompetence requires a second independent evaluator, not affiliated with the first, before any transition of control can be authorized." Matilda exhaled slowly. "But they don't know that." Franklin nodded. "Let them walk into the trap." The trap. It had been Walter's idea years before. "People don't just steal with guns and masks," he once told her. "They steal with paper, with titles, with diagnosis codes." He knew their wealth made them vulnerable, and he knew Matilda's heart too soft in the right places. So he'd built a fortress of ink. Now she had to decide how to use it. That evening she stood on the back patio and watched the wind move through the vineyard behind the house. The rows of vines were bare now, stripped for winter, but she remembered each one in full bloom. Walter had walked them daily in spring hand, trailing the leaves, whispering to them like they might answer. Behind her the kitchen door creaked. She turned. Maria stood there holding a small envelope. "He's coming," Maria said simply. "Noah. He said he'll be here in 2 days." Matilda reached out slowly, took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a note written on plain paper in a hand that had grown steadier with age. "I remember, I never forgot. I'll come quietly." N. Matilda stared at the words. A ghost answered. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she moved through the house with deliberate slowness, planting recorders documenting moments, building a case invisible to the eye but sharpened like a knife behind her breath. She knocked over a vase in the parlor on purpose, shattering glass. Marcus came running. She stared at the mess blankly. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed. "I think I was trying to water the plant, but I must have forgotten," she murmured. He crouched beside her, hand on her arm. "It's okay. These things happen." She nodded weakly. The next morning, Isabel found her sitting on the back steps in her nightgown, barefoot. "Are you all right? What are you doing out here?" Isabel asked, rushing to her side. I wanted to check the roses, but they're all gone, aren't they?" Isabel helped her inside, draping a blanket over her shoulders, speaking softly as if to a child. Matilda thanked her, apologized for being such a burden. She said all the things they needed her to say, and the recorders caught every single word. At lunch, Marcus brought it up again. "Dr. Hallen would like to run a few follow-ups. Nothing urgent, but we want to be proactive." Matilda stirred her soup and said quietly, "I'll try to remember. I forget so much these days." They exchanged a glance. Isabel reached across the table, squeezing her hand gently. "It's okay, Aunt Matilda. We'll help you." Yes, Matilda thought. Help me right off a cliff. That night she entered the library and stood before Walter's portrait. He looked younger in oil than he ever had in real life, stern, calculating kind only in the corners of his mouth. "I've done everything you told me," she whispered, "but it's worse than I thought. They're not even waiting for me to slip, they're pushing." She didn't cry. She was past crying. Instead, she sat at the desk and began drafting letters. One to the State Board of Psychiatry, one to the county court. One to the police department, preliminary statements, not accusations, but records of concern, just in case, she wrote at the bottom of each. Then she opened a new file on her desktop, titled it "If I Disappear." Inside, she placed audio recordings, scanned copies of Franklin's documentation, her own handwritten accounts, the codicil naming Noah. She left the folder open on the desktop, unhidden, just in case. The next morning, she took her tea alone on the east porch. The wind had shifted overnight. The scent of frost lingered in the hedgerows. Marcus passed her on the way to the garage. He nodded politely. She smiled, but her hands didn't shake. Not anymore, because the trap was set. Noah was coming, and Matilda Rhodes was no longer playing defense. She was waiting. The truck was old, a 1989 Dodge with a rusted side panel and a quiet rattle beneath the hood. But it climbed the winding road to the Rhodes estate like it belonged there. It reached the top at sunrise, just as the fog had begun to lift from the orchard's floor, curling around the wheels, like the morning was trying to swallow it whole. Matilda watched from the study window. No fanfare, no headlights, no announcement. He simply parked, stepped out, and stood there. Noah Linsdale, older now, late 40s. Broader shoulders than she remembered, but the same quiet posture, same eyes, still the color of wet bark after rain. His beard was trimmed short, flecked with gray, his coat worn thin at the elbows. She didn't go outside. She didn't have to. By the time she opened the door to the library, he was already standing in the hall. They looked at each other for a long time, no words, just years compressed into one long stare. Finally, he said, "You still make that awful lavender tea." Matilda cracked a smile. "Unfortunately for you." He stepped forward and wrapped her in an embrace. Solid, real, brief, like he was afraid to stay too long in the memory. They sat at the kitchen table with the shades drawn, the tea steeping untouched between them. Maria had made herself scarce as instructed, and the house was still sleeping upstairs. Noah leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, eyes sweeping the corners of the room with the kind of alertness Matilda recognized. "Who else is in on it?" he asked. "Isabel," she said, her voice steady. "But she's being pulled by Marcus. He's the mind behind it. Charming, controlled, dangerous. And the angle, guardianship," she replied. "Mental incompetence, fabricated evaluations. They already brought in a psychiatrist. Slanted the test. I pretended to fail." Noah nodded slowly. "You always were 10 steps ahead." "No," she said. "Walter was. I'm just playing the hand he left me." He looked at her, then really looked. "He wrote to me the year before he died, asked if I'd be willing. I thought he'd gone paranoid. Guess not." Matilda's face didn't move. "You're the only one I trust." He let that sit in the air a moment before asking, "So what's the move?" They moved into the back study, the red room as Walter used to call it. Deep crimson walls, thick velvet drapes, and no windows facing the main drive. A room made for secrets. Matilda opened the cabinet behind the globe bar and pulled out a slim briefcase. She laid it flat, popped the clasps, and revealed a series of folders, legal, financial, medical. "Here's everything Franklin confirmed," she said. "The codicil, the sealed trust, updates the clause naming you as successor guardian." He flipped through the documents in silence, eyes scanning each signature, each seal. "Your handwriting hasn't changed," he muttered. "Only the world around it." When he finished, he pushed the files aside and leaned forward. "All right. If you're serious about countering them, we do this in 3 phases. Matilda listened. Phase 1, verify every legal standing document with Franklin and file updated duplicates with the county clerk under a non-public status. Phase 2, reassign temporary financial power of attorney for emergency transactions to Noah with sealed confirmation through Walter's trust structure. Phase 3, identify, isolate, and remove any documents Marcus or Isabel have forged or are planning to submit before they reach a courtroom. Everything they've built depends on you not acting, Noah said. So now you act, but quietly, while they still think you're 2 steps behind. Matilda smiled thinly. They'll never see it coming. By that evening, Franklin had returned carrying an external hard drive and 2 notarized packages. The 3 of them met in the red room, and while the fireplace hissed behind them, they executed every motion with calm efficiency. Franklin handed Noah a black pen, temporary control of the liquidity accounts. 1 signature. It triggers nothing unless Matilda's name is flagged inactive or absent for more than 30 consecutive days. Noah signed. Matilda did the same. Now Franklin said, turning to her, "We duplicate and isolate the original deed from the county system. We move a shadow copy into a contingency trust, Langley, as discussed." Langley, Noah asked. Walter's mother's maiden name, Matilda explained. No one would ever connect it. By midnight, every document was locked behind layered encryption and physical safekeeping. The Rhodes estate, for the first time since Walter's death, was legally untouchable. Upstairs, Isabel and Marcus slept soundly in the guest suite. They had no idea. The next morning, Matilda played her part. She left the tea boiling too long, forgot where she put her scarf, asked the same question twice. Marcus didn't bother hiding his smirk anymore. "We should probably schedule a follow-up with Dr. Hallen," he whispered to Isabel over lunch. Isabel looked concerned, then nodded. "Maybe sooner than we thought." Downstairs, Noah installed a false drawer into Matilda's filing cabinet, replica documents, falsified appointment logs, and harmless but convincing proof that she was beginning to lose organizational control. "We give them exactly what they expect," Noah said. "Let them take the bait." Matilda watched the drawer slide shut, and when they reach for it, we close the trap. 2 days later, Marcus tried again. "Aunt Matilda, I'd love to go over some simple things with you just to make sure your accounts are in good shape." Matilda looked up from her crossword. "Oh, I think I gave all that to the gardener." He blinked. "You mean Maria's brother?" "No," she said sweetly. "Noah. He came back. Didn't I tell you?" The flash in his eyes was lightning fast, but she caught it. "That's unexpected," Marcus said tightly. "I suppose people do that when you call them." That night, Noah intercepted Marcus's email from the house network, an attempted message to a contact listed only as DH. Hallen. The subject, evaluation addendum request. Noah copied it, saved it, deleted the draft, logged the IP. "You're officially under surveillance," he told Matilda over whiskey in the Red Room. "Good," she said. "Let them sweat." On the third morning, Isabel confronted her. "Why is Noah here?" Matilda turned from her garden clippers, feigning confusion. "He works here. You didn't say he was back." "I didn't know I needed your permission." Isabel's voice wavered. "It's just sudden." "Noah's always been loyal," Matilda said, "not something everyone can claim." And then she walked away, leaving Isabel stunned in the gravel path, jaw flexing in the wind. That night, Matilda looked out her bedroom window and saw Marcus in the side yard on the phone. He was pacing, angry. His hands cut through the air in sharp, rigid lines. Noah stood at her shoulder, arms folded. "He's unraveling," Noah said. "He should." They watched him disappear behind the trellis, still talking. Noah's voice dropped to a murmur. "They're going to accelerate." "Let them." By week's end, Franklin confirmed that the contingency trust had been recognized legally, and the Rhodes estate was for all practical purposes removed from the reach of Marcus Isabel and any guardianship claim unless Matilda herself revoked it. "Let them come with their false documents," Franklin said. "Let them claim they're protecting you. The only thing they're protecting is their desperation." Matilda didn't reply. She was already writing the next step in her ledger. On the 8th night, she and Noah sat in the library. No lights, just the fire. She poured 2 glasses of bourbon, Walter's favorite. They didn't toast, didn't clink, just drank. He looked at her eyes, catching the firelight. "I thought I'd never come back here," Noah said. "And yet you did." "I owed him, I owe you." "No," she said, "you kept your word. That's more than most." Silence stretched between them, deep and real. Then Matilda leaned back, eyes closed. "I'm not fighting for the money," she said. "I'm not even fighting for the house." "Then what?" "For the principle," she said. "That love isn't a weapon. That memory isn't leverage. That I don't vanish just because someone thinks I'm too old to notice what they're doing." Noah nodded, slow and solemn, and the fire kept burning. Upstairs, Marcus finished his phone call. He had no idea what he'd already lost. It started with the peach cobbler. Matilda carried it across the street herself, arms slightly trembling, the old ceramic dish warm in her hands. She rang the bell at the Daltons' house, her longtime neighbors, a retired couple who once played bridge with Walter every Thursday for 15 years. When Mrs. Dalton opened the door, Matilda smiled wide, too wide, her lipstick uneven. "I brought something sweet," she said cheerfully, holding out the dish like a fragile peace treaty. "Walter always said cobbler fixes everything." "Oh, how lovely," Mrs. Dalton replied. She took the dish, but her eyes were searching. "Are you feeling all right, dear?" Matilda tilted her head to the left, off-center, like a photograph hung wrong. "I couldn't find my phone for 3 days," she said brightly. "Turns out it was in the oven." "Isn't that silly?" She laughed. "Alone." Mrs. Dalton didn't. Later, she heard Mrs. Dalton talking in hushed tones to her husband, standing just inside the door. "She's slipping," she said. "That poor woman. That house is too much for her." And Matilda smiled as she walked back across the street, her steps slightly uneven on purpose. The next morning, she knocked over a potted plant at the general store. The clerk, a college-aged boy with tired eyes, rushed to help her pick it up. "I thought it was a cat," she said quietly. "A little gray one. I swear I saw it move." There was no cat. At the pharmacy, she asked for a refill of a prescription she hadn't been on in 10 years. At the library, she told the front desk she was looking for her husband. "He was just here," she said, eyes darting. "He left his jacket. I think he went to the gardening section." The librarian gently touched her arm. "Mrs. Rhodes, your husband passed away." Matilda blinked, stared at the floor, then looked up slowly. "Oh," she said, "that's right. He did, didn't he?" By the end of the week, the whole town was talking. Marcus moved faster. He requested an expedited evaluation from Dr. Hallen, citing rapid cognitive decline and episodes of confusion witnessed by third parties. The forms were signed. A new date was set. He handed Isabel the paperwork with a kind of triumph, his voice low and urgent in the hall that evening. "She's unraveling perfectly. By next month we'll be in court." Isabel didn't look so sure anymore. Her eyes were darker now, less victory, more storm. What if she changes the paperwork? What if she's hiding something? "She's not hiding anything," Marcus said. "She thinks we're the only ones left who care." Matilda, listening from the alcove behind the stairs, recorded every word on the tiny silver device sewn into her coat hem. Later, she copied it onto 3 backup drives and labeled the file, "They think I'm falling." That night, Noah met her in the red room. Franklin was already there, seated at the desk, with his reading glasses low on his nose. The emergency proxy documents stacked in neat formation beside a lit candle. Matilda took the pen, signed her name. Franklin signed beneath it. Noah last. When it was done, the envelope was sealed in triplicate and stored in Franklin's off-site vault, a copy sent to the contingency trust. Matilda Rhodes had officially transferred temporary emergency authority over her financial, legal, and health decisions to Noah Linsdale under Clause 7A of the Rhodes Protective Directive. It was a weapon hidden in legalese, and it was ready. "Are you sure about this?" Noah asked as he walked her to the garden afterward, the moon glowing silver over the dormant vines. "It won't hold forever," she said, "but it holds enough." He paused. "You're letting them dig the grave. I'm handing them the shovel." They stood there for a while, the night heavy with unsaid things. Then Matilda whispered, "I never wanted it to be her." "I know." They didn't speak again. The next day, she invited Isabel to join her in the study. Isabel hesitated just for a moment, but agreed. They sat by the window, the light diffused through thin lace curtains, and Matilda played her role to the edge of fragility. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice a soft tremor, "about the house, the estate, everything." Isabel leaned forward, trying not to look eager. "You don't need to worry about that, Aunt Matilda. We're here for you." "No," Matilda said gently. "You're here for what comes after." Isabel froze. Matilda smiled faintly. "It's all right. I understand. The world's changed. Paper means more than people." "You don't have to lie to me," Matilda interrupted almost kindly. "But you should be very careful when you lie to yourself." Isabel stood abruptly. This was a mistake. I shouldn't have come." "No," Matilda said, voice now calm and clear. "The mistake was thinking I wouldn't notice." Isabel left in silence. Marcus came to her the following afternoon with a folder. "Just a few things from the attorney," he said casually. "Routine." Matilda opened the folder. Inside were simplified documents, power of attorney, medical release, a soft draft of a guardianship agreement masked under layers of legal fluff and placeholder titles. She flipped through them slowly, then closed the folder. "You forgot one page," she said. Marcus frowned. "What?" "The part where I sign without reading." He tried to laugh. "It's just preliminary." Matilda smiled. "Everything is." That night she wrote the line, 4 words on a small note card. She placed it in the antique clock in the hallway, the one Isabel always stared at when she passed, like it still haunted her from childhood. The card simply read, "The sane don't prove they're sane." Noah found it the next morning and placed it where she'd instructed between the pages of Walter's leather-bound research journal on elder law, left just visible enough if someone happened to flip through it, which Marcus eventually would, and he did. 2 days later, and when he saw the card, his face twitched. Not from fear, but from uncertainty. Exactly what Matilda wanted. The trap was working. Every performance, every paused sentence, every misplaced key, every repeated story was a thread in the web, and Marcus was pulling on all of them. At the town cafe, he met privately with Dr. Hallen. "I need it signed," he said under his breath. "No more delays." Hallen hesitated. "She's borderline. I can't justify it outright. Not yet." Marcus leaned in. "You're being paid for confidence, not caution." Hallen didn't answer. But Matilda got the recording anyway. She had her ways. Later that week, she accidentally sent Marcus an old appointment email from her doctor dated 3 years ago with the subject line "Neurological stability confirmed." She attached the wrong file, or so it appeared. Marcus opened it, saw the clean scan, fumed, then deleted it. But the forensics Noah had embedded in her outgoing mail server showed every detail when he opened it. How long he stared at it, how quickly he trashed it. More evidence, more pressure. And pressure makes people clumsy. That Sunday, Matilda hosted a small brunch. Just 4 guests: Mrs. Dalton, the local librarian, an elder from the Unitarian chapel, and a 5th chair left intentionally empty. She served tea and cake, told disjointed stories, repeated the same joke 3 times. They laughed politely. When Mrs. Dalton went to the kitchen to help with dishes, Matilda forgot who she was. "I'm sorry," she said with wide, gentle eyes. "I thought you were my sister." Mrs. Dalton didn't speak for a full 3 seconds. Afterward, she hugged Matilda and said, "We're here for you. Always." Matilda nodded. Then later that evening filed a statement with Franklin documenting the event, time-stamped and signed. Another performance, another stone laid. When Franklin returned the final revision of the emergency power agreement, Matilda took it to the west window of her bedroom, read it once, folded it, and locked it in the false floor beneath her armoire. If anything happened now, if they rushed to court, tried to push guardianship, Noah would be ready. The law would already be waiting. The documents were aligned, the recording secured, and the final line in her journal written in clear black ink: "If I must fall, let it be into my own hands, not theirs." The fog curled low over the Oregon hills that morning, dense, crawling like it knew something was coming. At exactly 6:03 a.m., Marcus's luxury SUV pulled up outside the Rhodes Estate headlights, slicing through the gray like scalpels. Inside, he was humming a tune. A calm man, composed, groomed, smiling at the rearview mirror. He had no idea. Matilda's room was empty. No note, no shoes missing, no bags gone, no signs of forced entry. Just an open window, and the faint scent of lavender still hanging in the sheets. Marcus froze. His hand trembled for the first time in weeks. He walked through the hallway twice, opened every closet, checked the basement, the attic, the sunroom. Nothing. No Matilda. Just silence. Heavy like a verdict. Isabel joined him 15 minutes later. She hadn't even brushed her hair. "She's gone," he said simply. There was a long pause before Isabel answered. "What do you mean gone?" Marcus turned to her slowly, vanished. And then came the first sound of real panic from Isabel since she returned to this house. "This wasn't the plan, Marcus. You were supposed to drive her to Elm Haven today, get the competency evaluation signed, and I know the damn plan," he snapped, "but plans fall apart when people disappear into fog." She clutched the stair railing. Maybe she wandered off. Sleepwalking, dementia. Marcus looked at her stone-faced. "You think someone who's supposedly mentally gone opened that window from the inside, removed no belongings, left no trace, and disappeared without triggering the alarm?" The truth stared at them like a mirror. "She staged it," he whispered. "She staged her disappearance." By 10:15 a.m., local police were called in. A patrol officer named Carver walked the grounds with a flashlight, even though it was broad daylight. "Elderly woman missing early hours, history of confusion," he asked, scribbling. Marcus nodded vigorously. "She's had episodes. Memory loss. We were taking her to get help this morning." Carver looked skeptical. "Any witnesses?" Isabel chimed in. "No, but we're afraid she might have wandered into the woods." Carver paused, looked at the sloped tree line behind the estate. "Fog was thick this morning. If she did, time is critical." Search parties were dispatched by noon. Volunteers, canines, even a local news crew arrived. A broadcast went live from the front gate. "Local woman 78 missing since early morning. Community joined search effort." Marcus stood in the background, jaw clenched. Isabel's hands were shaking, but not from sadness. From fear, because with every minute Matilda stayed missing, the tighter the police net became. At 2:47 p.m., a reporter asked, "Was Mrs. Rhodes under any sort of legal pressure? Financial dispute?" Marcus froze. "Excuse me." The reporter pressed on. "A few of the neighbors said you'd been managing her estate. Is that true?" Isabel stepped forward, smile strained. "We were assisting her, as family, that's all." But the look in the reporter's eyes said otherwise, and it was spreading whispers, doubts, the nagging sense that something wasn't right in this polished family picture. Back at the house, Marcus tore through Matilda's desk. Files were gone. The copy of the amended power of attorney they'd planted last week vanished. The psychiatrist's pre-written notes gone. The voice memo he left on his phone 2 nights ago, coaching himself through the conversation to have with the state-certified physician, deleted. He turned to Isabel, eyes wide. She cleaned the evidence. "Marcus," her voice cracked. "Do you think she has someone helping her?" He didn't answer. He just slowly sat down on the edge of Matilda's bed, the creak of the mattress loud in the stillness. "If she took the original will," he began, then where Isabel didn't finish, because both of them now saw the shadow of someone else in the game. Someone loyal, someone quiet, someone who owed Matilda everything. Noah. 3 days passed. No sightings, no phone calls, no demands, just silence and fog. By the 4th day, police began asking harder questions. Detective Landry, a woman with steel-gray hair and a background in fraud, showed up with a folder. She laid out copies of real estate transfer attempts, credit history manipulations, and the competency petition. She asked one question, "Why now?" Isabel blinked. "Why what?" Landry stared at her. "Why try to get her declared incompetent this week? Why not last year when she started declining? Why now right before she disappears?" Silence. Marcus coughed. "She'd become erratic." Landry raised a brow. "You called it erratic. Others call it precise." By the end of the week, Matilda's face was on every local paper. But beneath her portrait, faint smile, eyes sharp, there was a different kind of headline forming. Questions arise over Rhodes' estate. Suspicious timing behind disappearance. Family under scrutiny as records vanish. Day 9. A breakthrough. A local delivery man claimed he saw a woman matching Matilda's description near a post office in Eugene, Oregon, 2 counties away. The timestamp matched the exact day she vanished. The clerk said she mailed a single envelope. A federal subpoena was issued. When it arrived at the county clerk's office, it contained 3 items. The original handwritten will signed by Mr. Rhodes, a notarized letter from Matilda herself, stating her mental competence and intention to protect her assets from undue manipulation, and an audio recording. Police reviewed it in silence. Marcus's voice came through clear. "Just need her to seem off for a week. 2 tops. We get the psych eval, we get the deed. Then Elm Haven takes care of the rest. No mess." Then Isabel's voice. "And what if she snaps out of it?" "Marcus, she won't. That house belongs to us." An arrest warrant was issued within 48 hours. Marcus was taken first outside a gym, his face still wet from a shower. Isabel tried to flee. She didn't make it past the state line. Day 13. A courthouse press packed tense. Detective Landry stepped to the podium. "We believe this was an orchestrated attempt to exploit a vulnerable elder for personal gain, but this elder was far from helpless." A door opened at the back of the room, and Matilda Rhodes walked in, hair pinned back, scarf over her shoulders, calm, and beside her Noah, silent, solid, the man who owed her everything. Matilda faced the crowd. "I disappeared to protect what was mine, not because I was afraid, but because they were." No one clapped. They just watched. Because it wasn't a comeback, it was a reckoning. The courthouse was unusually quiet for a Friday. There were no murmurs of anticipation, no rustling papers, no hallway gossip. Just a cold, controlled stillness, like a theater waiting for its final act. 2 weeks had passed since Matilda Rhodes disappeared into the fog, and now 2 uniformed deputies stood at the back of courtroom 3B, eyes fixed on the oak-paneled door. At exactly 10:02 a.m., the door opened. Matilda stepped in. She wasn't rushed. She didn't scan the crowd or glance at the cameras. She walked like a woman who had been waiting for this moment all her life, poised, deliberate, untouchable. Behind her, Noah followed, dark suit, no tie, hair neatly combed, eyes steady. He carried a small briefcase in one hand and a worn canvas envelope in the other. Gasps broke through the silence. Reporters fumbled for their phones, and at the defense table Isabel's face drained of color. Marcus, already in a gray suit provided by county corrections, turned slightly and exhaled like he'd been punched in the stomach. Matilda's attorney, Ruth Kaplan, rose and nodded once. "Your Honor, the petitioner has returned. We are submitting new evidence." Judge Vernon, a veteran of 40 years on the bench, blinked slowly. "Proceed." Ruth stepped forward, her voice cool. "We submit Exhibit A, an original handwritten will signed by Arthur Rhodes dated 5 months prior to the contested amendment. Witnessed, notarized, and now verified through the state archivist." She placed the document gently on the clerk's table. "Exhibit B. A notarized statement by Matilda Rhodes dated 2 days before her disappearance, attesting to full mental competency and naming Mr. Noah Carter as her designated guardian as per the original will." Another paper laid down. Exhibit C. A digital audio file admitted into evidence under authentication by the Oregon Bureau of Investigations. The file contains conversations between Marcus Elliott and Isabel Lane discussing the strategic manipulation of Mrs. Rhodes's medical evaluations. The courtroom broke into low murmurs. Judge Vernon tapped his gavel. Silence. Ruth's voice didn't waver. And finally, Exhibit DA, signed affidavit from Dr. Philip Arnett, psychiatrist previously associated with Elm Haven Wellness Center, stating he was offered a financial incentive by Mr. Marcus Elliott to issue a premature diagnosis of dementia. Marcus flinched. Isabel let out a tiny, involuntary sound. It might have been a sob or a laugh. No one was sure. The judge flipped through the stack. "This is serious material, Miss Kaplan." "It is, Your Honor." Judge Vernon adjusted his glasses, peered at Marcus. "Mr. Elliott, do you deny offering money to a medical professional in exchange for fraudulent evaluation?" Marcus's mouth opened, but no sound came. "Do you deny that this conversation was recorded inside the Rhodes estate 2 nights before Mrs. Rhodes's disappearance?" Still nothing. The judge turned to Isabel. "Ms. Lane, do you have anything to say about your involvement?" Isabel stood. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just whispered, "We thought she was too old to fight back." The judge sat back slowly. "I am placing an emergency stay on all power of attorney transfers executed in the past 60 days. Furthermore, I am instructing the district attorney's office to open a formal investigation into attempted estate fraud, coercion, and conspiracy to exploit a vulnerable adult." Ruth Kaplan didn't smile. She just leaned closer to Matilda and whispered, "We're not done yet." Outside, the press swarmed. "Mrs. Rhodes, where were you? Who helped you escape? Did you fake your own disappearance?" Matilda paused on the courthouse steps. "I didn't escape," she said clearly. "I waited. That was all." Back in the safety of Ruth's office, Matilda and Noah finally sat down. She removed her scarf. Noah poured tea. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Do you think they ever saw me? Really saw me?" Noah shook his head. "They saw what they wanted to control." Matilda looked out the window. "They underestimated the wrong old woman." Noah smiled, as they always do. Meanwhile, the case unraveled. Investigators uncovered emails carefully deleted, but recovered where Marcus had corresponded with 2 lawyers in Nevada planning the silent sale of Rhodes estate assets once Matilda was committed. They found surveillance footage from a convenience store time-stamped 5:23 a.m., the day she disappeared, showing a hooded woman mailing legal documents. They recovered bank transfers, small but precise, leading to a shell account Marcus opened under a fake business name. But most damning of all, the call logs from Marcus's phone. Dozens of messages to Dr. Arnett in the weeks leading up to the medical intervention. One voicemail dated exactly 3 days before the disappearance said, "Get her certified. I don't care how clean it looks. I need this done. She's not going to give up control, so we take it." The voice was unmistakably Marcus. In the court of public opinion, the tide turned fast. What had been pitched as a tragic case of elder instability was now being seen as something else entirely. A failed heist, an attempted erasure of autonomy, a battle between perception and truth. And at the center stood a woman who had taught behavioral psychology for 37 years, who had published on manipulation, who had once testified in court on the power of silence. Matilda Rhodes was no victim. She was a strategist, When Isabel was finally charged, Count 1 conspiracy, Count 2 attempted fraud, she requested a private meeting with Matilda. It was granted. Inside a quiet holding room, the two women sat across from each other. No lawyers, no microphones. Isabel was the first to speak. "You were supposed to love me." Matilda looked at her without blinking. "I did." "Then why this? You tried to take away my voice." Isabel's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted a life." "You had one," Matilda said softly. "But it wasn't enough when you thought mine was worth more." As the door closed behind her, Matilda breathed in. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like reclamation. At the next hearing, the court formally reinstated the original will. Noah Carter was named legal guardian per Arthur Rhodes's request. And Matilda chose to remain in her home, but this time not in isolation. She reopened the small study room as a community learning center, offering weekly talks on elder rights, psychological resilience, and personal agency. Noah tended the garden. Teenagers helped her digitize her husband's manuscripts. And on a sunny Thursday afternoon, a group of college students sat in her living room listening to her say, "They tried to silence me, but I remembered something I once told my students. The loudest part of a storm isn't the thunder, it's the moment just before." Fade to black. The courtroom smelled of cold varnish and tired lies. Matilda stood tall, cane in hand coat, buttoned to the neck. The judge, a man 20 years her junior, adjusted his glasses, as if the weight of what he was about to say hadn't yet found his voice. But when it came, the words hit like thunder in a winter sky. "The court finds credible evidence of fraud, misrepresentation, and unethical manipulation regarding the mental fitness of Mrs. Matilda Rhodes." Marcus flinched. Isabel's hands clutched her purse so tightly the leather screamed. The judge continued, voice even merciless. "Dr. Marcus Langley is hereby suspended from the practice of psychiatry, pending the outcome of a full investigation by the State Medical Board." In the back, a reporter scribbled furiously. Another whispered into a phone, "Isabel Grant is to be investigated as a potential accomplice to conspiracy to defraud and elder abuse." Matilda didn't blink. She didn't need to. She had seen enough tribunals in her time to know the worst part is never the ruling. It's the moment when the illusion breaks. Outside flashbulbs greeted her like summer lightning. But Matilda said nothing. She simply lifted her head and walked toward the town square. Noah was waiting beside the old iron fountain. "It's done," she said. "Not quite," he answered. "But it's enough." The headlines the next day read, "Beloved Professor Vindicated in Elder Abuse Scandal. Town Icon Outsmarts Greedy Heirs." Matilda didn't read them. She had no interest in noise. But the town did. Whispers turned to nods. Cold shoulders warmed. One by one, neighbors who had stayed silent or skeptical began to show up at the gates on the porch at the market. A woman from the cafe where Isabel once bragged about her inheritance came by with cinnamon rolls and tea. "I never believed her," she said. "But I didn't say anything either. I should have." Matilda accepted it with a single sentence. "We're all braver in hindsight." That week she returned to the university where she had once taught courses in ethics and behavioral logic. The lecture hall felt smaller now, but warmer, fuller. The dean greeted her at the steps. "I hope you'll forgive the silence." "I prefer action to apology," she said, "always have." Together they unveiled a new banner draped across the wall of the university commons. "The Rhodes Legacy Scholarship, for those who speak when silence is expected." Noah took a photo of her beneath it, sharp, proud, defiant. The ceremony was modest, as Matilda had insisted. A few former students attended. So did several women from the town's legal aid office, those who had once filed complaints that never went anywhere. Matilda gave a speech. But it wasn't about revenge. Justice, she said, is not the absence of cruelty. It is the insistence that cruelty be answered not by rage but by reason. There are many kinds of guardianship. The most dangerous kind is the one you abandon your right to speak, to question, to resist, even when your hands shake. Applause broke out. She didn't flinch. She closed her notebook, took a breath, and stepped down. Later that afternoon, she visited the local library. She hadn't returned in over a decade. The librarian looked stunned. Then she whispered, You're the reason I applied here." Matilda walked slowly through the aisles, hand-grazing the spines of old philosophy books. She stopped at one, her husband's favorite, a battered copy of The Republic. She sat in a leather chair, opened it, and smiled. Inside, he had written once in faded ink, "For Tilly, if the world ever forgets who you are, remind it." Meanwhile, the consequences rippled outward. Marcus's suspension became permanent, his license revoked. The psychiatric board issued a public statement citing gross ethical violations, willful collusion in fraudulent capacity evaluations, and failure to disclose financial interests. His name was removed from the directory. He moved out of state. No one followed. Isabel, on the other hand, was still in town. She had no job now. The inheritance she once assumed was hers had evaporated. Friends distanced themselves. One morning she appeared at Matilda's gate. Noah saw her first. "She's here." "Let her in," Matilda said. Isabel looked smaller, now frayed, disheveled eyes glassy. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "That's the thing about doors," Matilda said. "Once you choose the wrong one, it doesn't matter how gently you close it." Isabel cried. Matilda did not. But she didn't raise her voice either. "I loved you like my own," she said. "But I won't pretend love excuses betrayal." She handed Isabel an envelope. Inside, a brochure for a rehabilitation program for victims and perpetrators of elder abuse, paid in full, no signature. Isabel left without a word. By month's end, the scholarship fund had already received 23 applications. The local high school principal sent a thank you letter signed by a group of seniors who had been following the story. At Sunday service, the pastor quoted Matilda's courtroom statement, "Strength is not what you hold, it's what you refuse to surrender." She didn't attend the service, but she heard about it from 5 different people before noon. Even the sheriff came by one evening. "I owe you," he said. "We should have seen it." "You did," she replied. "But seeing means little if you don't look twice." They shared a drink on the porch. Noah refilled the glasses. Across the street, children played near the fence. One waved. Matilda waved back. She didn't feel victorious. She felt present. And that was better. It started with a quiet Saturday morning. The garden, once overgrown and forgotten, now brimmed with life. Matilda stood at the center, watching a group of children carry books across the gravel path. The new community library had finally opened, built on the land where her late husband once planted roses and where she had found solace in the dirt. Now the old garden bore fruit in a different form knowledge. Noah adjusted a shelf near the entrance. He had changed so much since she last saw him all those years ago, but one thing remained: the quiet loyalty that had once saved her life. He smiled when he caught her watching. "You think it'll work?" he asked, stacking a few history volumes upright. Matilda looked around. Young hands flipped pages, old hands shelved returns. Conversations hummed without noise. "It already is," she replied. Then came the letter. It arrived in an envelope with no return address, slipped quietly into the drop box next to the entrance. Matilda found it when she was alone. Noah had gone into town, and the afternoon was overcast, like the world was holding its breath. The envelope was cream-colored, handwritten in a script she hadn't seen in years. Inside one folded page, no signature. "I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I was taking back what belonged to me. But the truth is I was lost. I wanted to matter to someone, to anyone, and I let that desire blind me. I remember your lullabies, Auntie. I remember the smell of your kitchen. I remember feeling safe in your stories. I'm sorry I tried to steal what you protected." Matilda read the letter twice, then once more, then folded it again carefully and placed it in the drawer beside the ledger of library donors. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply sat there, the weight of ink pressing harder than any courtroom verdict could. She never told Noah about the letter. Later that evening, they had dinner under the pergola. The vines had started to wrap around the new beams, as if time agreed to rebuild with them. Noah shared a memory about the day Matilda's husband taught him to graft apple trees. Matilda laughed, not a polite laugh, but a full-bodied, open-throated laugh she hadn't felt in years. And still the letter sat beside her bed unread by anyone else. A few days passed. She returned to her daily routine, reading with children, advising a former student on her graduate thesis, sharing coffee with the woman who ran the town bakery. Life moved with a rhythm again, but one afternoon she stood at the window and said aloud to no one in particular, "I forgive you." Noah overheard it but said nothing. In the following week, an article about the library appeared in the town paper. Matilda declined interviews but allowed the photographer to capture a moment of her reading to a child by the window. In the photo, her hand rested gently on the child's back. The caption read, "From silence, stories grow." The past, though heavy, began to fold itself neatly into the pages of her present. One morning she entered the library early and found a book out of place, Wuthering Heights, placed backwards on a shelf. As she reached to fix it, something slipped from between the pages. A photograph. It was old, slightly faded, but unmistakable young Isabel sitting on Matilda's lap, their eyes locked, laughing under a sunlit canopy. She froze. For a moment her knees felt weak, but she stood straight, set the photo aside, and kept shelving. No tears, just resolve. That night she sat on the back steps with a blanket around her shoulders. The stars had begun to come out slowly, shyly, and for once she didn't think about revenge, or trials, or signatures. She thought about stories, how they begin with trust, drift through betrayal, and sometimes, just sometimes, end with a quiet sort of mercy. She whispered to herself, "You cannot control who remembers you, but you can choose what you leave behind." Then she took the photo and the letter, placed them in a plain envelope, and labeled it, "For the day I'm gone." She didn't seal it, she didn't hide it. She just placed it in the back of the library's copy of Little Women, a book Isabel once loved. The kettle whistled softly. Matilda stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. Outside, the garden bathed in golden morning light. Dew clung to the lavender. The oak tree swayed gently as if waving to her. She sipped her tea. Noah was out there, crouched beside the hydrangeas with pruning shears. He moved like he had always belonged to this place, to this soil, this silence. He looked up, once caught her gaze, and smiled, calm, grounded, certain. Matilda responded with a nod that said, "We made it." The past months had been a storm, but now in this fragile stillness she could breathe again. She walked into the sunroom where the morning paper lay folded neatly on the coffee table. The front page headline read, "Court upholds Rhodes' will. Noah Campbell named legal guardian." She read it twice, not for clarity, but closure. It was real now, not just strategy or survival. It was recognition. Justice wrapped in ink and legal authority. Her fingers hovered over the page, then pressed gently, like sealing something into the past. She recalled the moment the judge's gavel had dropped. The silence afterward was not relief. It was something heavier, the acknowledgement that she had not imagined it all. The manipulation, the gaslighting, the strategic affection that came with Isabel and Marcus. The false memories they tried to plant. The doctor's falsified records. The staged forgetfulness. The attempts to erase her. And yet here she was. Noah entered through the back porch, wiping dirt from his hands on an old towel. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep. The air felt clean." He poured himself coffee and joined her on the sunroom couch. Neither spoke for a while. The garden buzzed quietly beyond the glass walls. "You did it," he said finally. Matilda laughed, soft and ironic. "No, we did." There had been moments, dark ones, when she'd nearly caved, when she questioned her own sanity, when Marcus's confident voice made her doubt her memory, when Isabel's tears blurred the lines between manipulation and sorrow. But every lie left a trace, and Matilda, ever the behavioral scholar, followed those traces. She had played the long game, faked the fog, stumbled where she needed to stumble, missed names on cue, let them think they were winning. She'd used every moment alone to record conversations, cross-reference handwriting, and confirm the inconsistencies. The original will hidden in an old dictionary sealed in wax. The audio tapes of Marcus's offhand remarks. The letter from the bribed doctor who later confessed under pressure. She didn't just defend herself, she dismantled them. The legal victory was one thing, but this morning it was emotional. She stood and opened the back doors. The air was cool, fragrant. Bees danced over thyme blossoms. She stepped into the garden barefoot. A memory surfaced years ago. She and her late husband Richard planting these very herbs. He would laugh when she corrected his spacing. She had always been precise, meticulous. He had been chaos and poetry. She missed him. "Richard," she whispered, kneeling beside the rosemary bush. "I kept the promise. No one used your name in vain, not even your niece." Noah watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't interrupt.
Back in the kitchen, Matilda placed the newspaper beside the radio and turned it on. A local station played box air on the G-string. She closed her eyes, the melody filling the house like water in a dry well. Then came the news segment. In a rare decision this morning, the court finalized its ruling in the Rhodes estate case, naming Noah Campbell, former groundskeeper and longtime confidant, as the rightful legal guardian of the estate per the original will of Professor Richard Rhodes. The ruling comes after weeks of legal dispute, which saw accusations of psychological manipulation, document tampering, and elder abuse. Marcus Trenton, fiancé to Isabel Cross, is facing further investigation from the medical board. The radio voice continued, but Matilda didn't need the rest. She knew what came next. She had watched these men before men who thought charm could rewrite law, who thought women like her were too lonely, too old, too ripe for redefinition. But now she was rewritten only by her own pen. A knock at the door. She paused. Noah answered it. A courier handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter. No return address, no signature, just a familiar handwriting. Matilda opened it. The scent of lavender oil wafted from the page. Isabel, I see it now. You were never the one forgetting. I was the one who didn't want to remember. I don't ask for forgiveness. Just wanted to say you were always sharper than we knew. She folded the letter, said nothing, placed it inside her bookshelf between 2 volumes of Jung. Forgiveness, maybe. But not today. She wasn't vengeful, just no longer naive. At noon, Matilda and Noah sat out 2 chairs beneath the wisteria trellis. A group of children passed by on their way home from the local school. One waved, Matilda waved back. Soon the community would arrive for the dedication of the Rhodes Community Reading Garden. What was once a battlefield of property and power was now a sanctuary of stories. Benches with plaques, a memory stone for Richard, and a winding path named after Matilda's father, a man who taught her that dignity never needs to shout. A young girl approached holding a tulip. "Are you Mrs. Rhodes?" she asked. "I am." "Daddy said you beat the people who tried to trick you." Matilda smiled, crouched down. "No, dear. I just reminded them that truth doesn't retire." The girl grinned and ran off. Noah leaned over. "You could run for mayor with lines like that." Matilda rolled her eyes. "I'd rather be the librarian." He chuckled. "Then I'll plant trees around your library." They sat in silence. The sun drifted lower, casting long shadows across the trimmed lawn. Noah reached for her hand. "You think she'll come back?" he asked. Matilda didn't answer right away. She looked at the sky clouds forming slowly like thoughts. "I don't know," she said. "But if she does, I'll be ready. This time not to fight. Just to see if she's finally looking at me without a mask." They sat as the breeze picked up. And then the final line. Matilda turned to Noah and said, "You know it's not the title that matters, guardian, owner, survivor. It's the choice. This time I chose who would guard me, and that's freedom."